we are here today for using worked examples. I hope that's what you signed up for. And the reason why you're here, my name is Stephanie Kidd. I'm a math consultant here at KVEC. And Miss Wanda Adams is also here today. She's our math consultant at KVEC. But for today, we're going to work on just using these worked examples and what that looks like in every classroom.
I'm Wanda Adams, and like Stephanie said, I'm a math consultant here at KVEC, and I kind of work more toward the early elementary and elementary level, while Stephanie works on the middle school and high. We work together, of course, but that's our specialties.
All right, our objectives for today is why do we use worked examples? That's going to be a big one. What does the research say about it? What are worked examples and how do we use those? The types of worked examples, there's 4 of those, by the way. Create worked examples. We're going to actually create some, and that's how you're going to get your certificate, is you're going to create some worked examples and put them into a spot. And that way everybody has access to them. And then you have multiple ones for your grade level. And that's our hope for this training. And then, of course, how do we teach using those worked examples? Some things that we're going to think about while we're doing this. Well, one is, what is the concept or the procedure that you've recently taught? Think about something you've recently taught that you wish you'd had an example, a really good example for your students to use. And then what examples did you use in your lesson, and can we use those as a worked example possibly? And then how do you pick your examples? You know, is it just because it's in the book and that's the book I'm using? Is it something I saw on the internet and I thought it would be great? How do you pick those worked examples? Hopefully you're thinking with your kids in mind. And then how do you use your students? How do you engage your students with these examples that you're using? You know, is it just I'm working through them? Am I questioning my students? Those kind of things. And then how do you sequence the examples that you're using? Do you start with the most complex and then kind of hone in on just a specific misconception? Or are you actually starting with the simpler and moving toward the more complex? Those are questions that you can think about when we're going through this. How do I actually pick the examples I'm using? So just take a few minutes and think about the content you're teaching at this point in time, a worked example that you may want to create, or maybe you want to think about the content you're getting ready to teach.
And then, of course, you can refer to those structured notes that we sent to you. That was in the email that I sent yesterday evening. If you did not get that, so you can actually download that, use it as a Word document if you'd like, if you prefer to do it that way.
One of the things I want you to think about also is that Rachel Snyder suggests that when we use examples to engage our students in new content, and we make the content more accessible to the students by building on a key feature or procedure, we end up having less issues or less mistakes made by the students. So keep that in mind. And also examples, they help with the coherence and allow for conceptual connections. So we want our students to see this, and Ms. Wanda's going to talk about this in a little bit, but we want them to see the example that fits back with the conceptual part you're teaching. So, and we'll talk about that more, because examples can be procedure based, and that's not how our students need to be taught in mathematics. So we're going to tie it all back in, we promise. All right, so why do we use worked examples? Well, this is a big question. One, limited working memory capacity. And if we think about our students, one of the things that they always have trouble with is processing speeds and their working memory. Now, working memory for a normal person is like no more than 7 bits of information at a time. So if there's only 7 bits of information that a normal person can handle, and we have a student who has a disability, that amount of information that they can handle at the time becomes smaller. So keep that in mind. So now, how do I make sure my examples are there so that my students not having to use way too much and be cognitively overloaded, and at that point just shut down on us? That's what we want to make sure that we're doing with these worked examples. We're not overloading them cognitively. Also, if you think about it, when we're using our working memory, It's just real small. It's not like our long-term memory where we can store bunches of information in it. Our working memory has to be entwined with some of the previous stuff that we've already done or that we already know to create strands in our brain. And in those strands, as they become stronger, at that point, that gets into the long-term memory because we make connections. We build on that schema. Now, if I go back to the limited working memory, what happens there is I have intrinsic, which is what's going on in my brain, and extrinsic, which is what's happening with the teacher. How did the teacher set these up? So that's huge because extrinsic is a form of our working memory load and it's imposed by many elements. And like I said, it can be the part that the teacher's explaining, the presentation. Is there too much on that presentation that's taking away from other things? And our kids who have ADHD or have issues with being able to take in a lot of information, at that point, they get overloaded. So worked examples actually takes away from that cognitive load. And we work through one mistake at a time. Now, once we've built into this, and Ms. Vaughn, like I said, is going to talk about this a little bit later, but she's going to talk about how we build this back into what they've already done conceptually. And when we do that, that helps them to not have to worry about just going through and doing the individual steps, but also they begin to understand those steps that they have to do, but to understand what's happening in the process. And then, of course, the last one is the automaticity that we want them to have, that fluency that we want them to have, but that develops when that schema has been completely developed. So making sure, so just to recap, what we're going to do is first, it's going to lighten their working memory load. And then they're going to recover and they're going to remove the focus from the computation to basically the strategies, and they're going to develop more accurately and more understanding. And then, of course, they're going to support the development and be able to explain it. That's what we want them to be able to do. Explain the process. And then last, of course, we're going to focus on one problem area at a time. So when we're doing these, that's going to be the big thing. Now, the ways we tend to think about math. First of all is procedural fluency. Well, unfortunately, procedural fluency should not be our focus. We should be going to the conceptual understanding. That needs to be first, even though most of the time we focus procedurally. We want to focus on conceptual understanding and then build into the problem-solving application of it. And this comes into play as they build the conceptual understanding. Students will display better cognitive or conceptual understanding after completing assignments that include analyzing correct worked examples and even incorrect worked examples. So we want them to work their way through it conceptually so students can be more accurate, they can be more flexible, they can be even more efficient. And then at that point, students will self-assess themselves in their understanding and the steps of the problem. At this point, they have procedural fluency. So at this point, we have, with worked examples, we're going to have arrows, we're going to have color coding, we're going to have lines, we're going to focus our students in on the math concepts that they need to develop. So that's all that we're going to do the entire time we're working through examples. All right, Ms. Vonda, I'm going to play your video, or do you want to talk first?
Go ahead and play the video and then we'll replay it again probably.
Okay.
As you can see, Stephanie's done a little doodly of the CSA model. And there's 3 parts. And you have the concrete, the semi-concrete, and the abstract. And you can see that under, when we're talking about concrete, we're referring to manipulatives. Manipulatives are what we call math tools. It's the tools that we use to explain. something to our students, it's tools we use to model, but most importantly, it's the tools that the kids use. We put these tools in their hands and they model, and it helps them to understand conceptually what concept we're trying to get across to them, whether it be in primary with addition or whether it be in high school, middle and high with algebra. We have tools that we use for algebra as well. So that's what we're talking about when we say concrete, and it's not something that's just done in the primary. And then we move on from that.
Let's go back to that concrete just real quick, because we use some of the same tools.
Mm-hmm.
So they need to keep that in mind too, that it's not always, I used a bead string in middle school. I used a bead string with my fifth graders. So it doesn't have to be something different or elaborate or anything else. So keep that in mind, guys.
True. And then, of course, after we have modeled and used those tools, then we have the kids link that to a semi-concrete where they would actually do drawings, or eventually then they want to be able to do those with mental images of what it would look like. And that's the stage that we spend. We normally we don't move from concrete and leave it. We take it along with us, and we have concrete and we move into the semi-concrete and we bring the two together. And then after we get really good at that, then we throw in the abstract. Now that abstract is when we're talking about using the numbers and those symbols. So lots of times teachers will make that mistake. They will go straight to the abstract, and then they'll think, oh, well, they're not getting it. I guess I need to go back and show them how. And that's the wrong method. I mean, that's the wrong steps. First, we begin with that concrete, no matter what grade level we're working with. We move it into the semi-concrete and then to the abstract. Now, we actually created a model, and Stephanie, I did link that. If you want to click on up there where it's underlined CSA model, it'll take us to that. And you can see our work map. This is a work map that we created, and I'm going to drop this in a folder that we're going to share with you all at the end of tomorrow. And it will have, this is something you can print out, and we actually can use the tools. You see there's an area there, a space for the concrete, where you can actually have the kids build on that. And then they take that and then they actually draw a representation of what they built. And then when they're ready, they can write the number sentence, whatever they're working on, at the bottom for the abstract using those symbols. So it's a tool we created. It could be run on just a standard size sheet of paper, or we've actually put them on the really large legal size paper for the little ones that are working with those larger tools. All right, Steph, if you want to take us back.
I want to go back to this. If you've got somebody who's really struggling, and let's say they're not in special ed, let's talk about those kids that struggle. This is a perfect tier 3 for those kids. The CSA model is a perfect tier 3. Now keep in mind, you have to do all parts of it, but it is a perfect tier 3.
True. It's a great SDI. True.
Okay, Miss Wanda.
All right, I think we can advance on it. It may play again on you. That's why I was saying it may review it. Yeah.
Well, we can review
we'll try to advance. So again, concrete, that's the use of those manipulatives. Semi-concrete, that's those drawings and mental images. And then the abstract, that's when we use those symbols for representations and numbers. And of course, we do that at minimum 3 times, and then 2 times with that abstract. But that's the minimum that we want to give the kids. Most kids are going to need more experiences than that with it.
Yeah, definitely more experience than that.
Okay, now this slide is one that Stephanie found, just talking about using representations and multiple, and that's what we're referring to when we talk about that CSA model, or the multiple representations. And you can see on the left side is what the teachers are doing. Obviously, we have to be very careful about selecting tasks that will be friendly with the kids, as far as them being able to use different tools or different ways to represent a task, to actually solve a task. And then, of course, it's talking about allowing instructional time. It does take time to do this. It takes a little more time to get those tools out and to organize them and teach the kids how to use them and instill in them that those are tools and not toys. That does take time. But I always tell everyone we can't afford not to take the time, because guess what happens? If we don't do it the first go around, we end up having to backtrack and go back and do it anyway. So why not do it the first time and get the kids going along? You're actually going to save yourself some time if you get the tools out and you'll work with the kids with them. We're introducing those different types of representations to the kids and that type of thing. That's what the teacher's doing. The students over here, they're making the decision about what tool am I going to need to use? What would I use to represent this? How would I represent this in a drawing form? Or how can I link this to what I've learned already? So that's what's going on with the students. And whenever I looked at this yesterday and I was preparing, it dawned on me, oh my gosh, this is our SMPs. This is the standards for mathematical practices right here in this form again. We see so many different forms of it, so many different kid-friendly forms and that type of thing, but that's what this actually is. It's looking at, having our kids make sense of those problems. It's having them think about it abstractly and quantitatively, and they're having to, and when we get into talking about actually the worked examples, what those actually the kids have to do with them, you'll see even more of these SMPs. They're going to have to think about and critique other students' work. That's a big piece of that with worked examples. And then of course they're looking to see if did they attend to precision and did they choose the appropriate tools. And so it's really hitting on all of our standards for mathematical practice as well. So that's another bonus for using these with our kiddos.
Ms. Fonda, I also want to point out that this is also a great HLP 12 because it's a systematic design of instruction and it flows right through. And it's an HLP 15 with scaffolding or instruction.
Worked examples. Worked examples will emphasize a pattern. The kids will be looking for patterns when they'll either be looking at, like Stephanie said earlier, there's 4 types. No matter what type they're looking at, they're looking to see if they can make a pattern and make a connection to another problem whenever they tackle another one. It can go from conceptual learning, which is what we just talked about, to that structured procedural learning. Procedure, there's nothing wrong with procedure. We want our kids to learn a procedure, but we want them to understand why the procedure works, not learn the procedure first and then understand why it works. That's what happened to me when I first started working here. When I first started working with algebra tiles, Stephanie was showing me all these things, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's why that works. That should have never worked that way for me. I should have had an understanding first and then learn the procedure. All I knew was that FOIL method. I could do that. I could do that all day long, but I didn't understand why it worked. So that was such an aha moment for me, that our kids deserve better than just being taught a procedure. They need an understanding of it first. And then of course, it focuses on structural aspects for them to understand those concepts, looking at the different steps and not just looking at the steps and mimicking the steps, but understanding why those steps work in that procedure. So when Stephanie and I were planning on this, we really wanted to make sure that we drive home the importance of the conceptual understanding first, because we are not proponents of teaching kids procedure. That is not what this is about. This is about giving the kids examples and asking really good probing questions to get at that understanding. That's what this is all about today.
And also, Ms. Wanda, let's talk about the fact that this is about kids being able to explain what they're seeing that's happening.
Right.
This reminds me kind of your favorite video. The little girl who does 12 times 12. I know that. And she says, it's 144. I'll never forget that. And then what happens?
Then she can't explain it. She's been taught, she's just memorized it. That's a video referring to fluency, but she's not fluent. She just memorized it. She doesn't. Fluency means an understanding, being flexible with your understanding as well. So like I said, we most definitely want you to understand that we want you to go at this with the understanding that this is going to help your kids build that conceptual understanding as well. It's going to bring it along. Like I said earlier, it just really encourages them to think critically about the math and not just learn step 1, step 2, step 3, and so on, and how to mimic that with other problems. All right, so worked examples. They show a solved problem with visual prompts. For example, tests, arrows, color coding, or highlighting. And you'll see some of that in some of our examples that we've got for you here today and tomorrow. And they provide information about the problem-solving process. So it's information about that process. And here, especially for our kiddos, we want to think about for sure using those arrows and using that color coding. And I was thinking the other day when I was sharing one of these that I had done with Brenda, and I was talking about how that this is a perfect way to scaffold that. You give it to them with the highlighting on there, you give it to them with the color coding on there, and then you slowly just remove some of it. And the next time you may give it to them with a little less highlighting, or maybe remove the arrows. But we scaffold it and we just slowly remove that help that we give them along the way.
One thing I want to say with this, Miss Vonda, is if you're doing something like color coding for your students and it's in the worked examples, provide them with the ability to color code their own when they're working through them, because that will help. For my students, one of the things that I used to do was they had to write it in, if it was a negative, they had to write it in red. That way it really popped out at them. And so if they were writing that negative in red and they understood that, it was negative, that whole section was supposed to be negative, sometimes I would have them to underline it or to box it in red. That way it really popped out at them and they understood that. So keep that in mind. If you're doing it in the example, have them have the ability to also do that.
Right, and this supports worked examples also supports that self-explanation principle, and that's where that the students self-assess their own work for their understanding. And then, of course, that just leads to greater gains. Whenever we figure out something on our own, we really can remember that much more readily than if someone just shows us how to do it. Or, because Stephanie, lots of times she'll come to my rescue when it comes to technology, because she's taught me so much in the past 4 years. But if I can spend the time and fumble around enough and figure it out myself, I remember it way better than what I do if she just comes over and shows me how to do it. So I like to relate things back to things that make sense to me. So you'll hear lots of analogies out of me today. That's the way I remember things.
It's also kind of like our shelf building. We remember how to do it because we struggled through it. It's part of that productive struggle that we have.
Exactly. Okay, so we have an effective method to improve learning, and there is research behind this. There's actually an article that Stephanie shared with you from What Works Clearinghouse that actually there was 4 studies that were done to prove that this is an effective method for kids to learn. And so it's not something we're just decided we like and we want to do it. There's actually research behind it, backing it up for us. So first of all, knowledge is gained from the example. It must be applied to solving a new problem, and that needs to come immediately. It's not show them a bunch of examples and then send them off to work. That's not what worked examples are. That's not how it works. You show the worked examples there, and there's lots of probing questions that go along with it. And then they work a sample problem just like it. And then you present example and then similar problem right after. Sorry, I jumped ahead of myself. So that's the next step there. And then effective problem solving rules are formed when target problem solving can be guided by an accessible source example. So if you'll think about it, I was thinking about that yesterday, like I said, when I was reflecting back on this. I always reflect back to my own learning. And I can remember those old textbooks that we had, and they would put the sample problems in there for us. And we would look at some of the sample problems, and then you'd come across that one that there was no sample like it. There was no example for me to look at. And I was one of those procedure gals. Like I said, you show me a procedure and I'd do it. But there would be those one or two that you just couldn't find anything to help you out with. And I was thinking, that's what teachers do sometimes to their kids. They'll do that sometimes. They'll give them, they'll show them examples, and they'll work through samples, and then they'll throw them for a loop and throw something in there that they've not even seen before. So the good thing about this, that's not what this is all about. This is all about showing them those worked examples, then asking those really good questions and making them think about the thinking that went into those examples, and then giving them a problem that, for lack of better words, is parallel to that, because that's one of the types that you can immediately go and apply that knowledge that you gained. So that's pretty much the scenario of how that's going to work.
I think the big key here, Miss Wanda, is the fact that they need to provide similar problems, and that similar
Mhm.
problem needs to be, if you're focusing on a specific skill or a specific concept, that is definitely what is put there in front of you. You don't want it to be off in any way, including if I've got middle school, high school teachers here, including down to if it's got an exponent in it, the next problem will have an exponent in it so that they follow through. So
Mhm.
keep that in mind.
Right, right. And think about that. If you know, I mean, if you've been teaching the same grade for 3 or 4 years, you know what kinds of problems the kids are going to get hung up on. You know what's going to happen. So why not go ahead and make those your worked examples? Put those problems out there for the kids and go ahead and help them to work their way through that. You know they're going to hit that bump. Go ahead and smooth it out for them. Help them along the way. So that's whenever Stephanie referred to the task we're going to ask you to do for us tomorrow. That's what I want you to be thinking about as we finish up today and work in tomorrow. Think about the areas that your kids have trouble in math. Think about what you've seen, and think about what kind of problems you could put out there to help them get over that little hurdle that they're going to come across.
But also, if they're doing these problems, make sure they're different enough to where they don't get confused in it too. So an example is if you've got 2 with the square root of 2, you don't want them to think that it's 2 times 2. So the next one, if it's 3 to the square root of 2, 3 squared, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. If it's 2 squared, you don't want them to think it's just 2 times 2 and they're just timesing those, that they really understand if it's 3 squared, that it's 3 times 3. So making sure they understand that. So giving them something that they're not going to get confused on is another big thing too, or that they can get hung up on.
Right. And once we get into those incorrect examples, you'll see how that can really take care of that issue with you too. So like I said, once we get to those types. Okay, go ahead and advance us on, I think. No, go back one. There we go. I like this one. I like this slide. Note that worked examples are not the same as working examples. Because when I first heard of the term worked examples, I thought, well, that's what we all do, isn't it? We all work examples for our kids. That's not what this is. Worked examples are examples that are already worked out. The solution's there. We're not asking for the solution. We're asking, how did they get to that solution? That's the good thing about worked examples. We're wanting to know the how and the why, not the what, as in what is the answer. So that's the good thing about worked examples. So bear that in mind while we're working at these. And of course, the kids are constantly analyzing and reasoning and trying to figure out why they got what they did. And in the case of the incorrect, they're trying to figure out why they got that wrong and what could they have done to fix that. So lots of good questioning has to go along with this examples. That's the hard part when you're developing these. When I developed them for us for tomorrow, that was my hard part, was coming up with the questions that I would ask the kids. It wasn't the examples. I knew what I wanted to work on there, but what kind of questions would I ask to get my kids to explain their thinking and the understanding that I wanted them to have?
I also like the fact that worked examples provide students with the ability to self-assess their understanding of what's going to
Mm-hmm.
happen next. So, and am I doing that part? So that's a good thing about worked examples.
And then, of course, we have this quote here from William Paul Thurston: mathematics is not about the numbers, equations, computations, or algorithms. It is about understanding. And that should be our motto, I think, Stephanie. That's what we're all about. It's about the understanding, making sure our kids understand all along the way, all the way up, building that foundation and making sure that they understand what's underneath before we start layering more on. Because, as we all know, we're only as strong as our foundation. So and lots of times our kids will hit those bumps. Um, I talk about how that whenever kids, there'll be those perfect students, those high flyers that I call them, all the way through, uh, especially through elementary. They hit into that middle and they get into that eighth grade and they may get into that pre-algebra and that algebra and those concepts, and they just hit a wall because all they've done all along is procedure. And they've been those perfect little students. You show me how, I'll go do it. You show me how, I'll go do it. But don't ask me to tell you how I got it or why it works that way. I just know it works. They don't like to explain their thinking because they really don't understand it well enough to explain their thinking.
Vonda, I found that once students get out of high school and go into college, that ability to think of why this has happened, they don't understand that. And they have issues when they're in college
Mm-hmm.
because they're not taught the process of understanding why something is done. They're just show this procedure and this is why you
Mm-hmm.
do it. And a big example was the geometry part. I know when I went to high school, my teacher taught me the theorems, and we had to write a theorem about why we did such stuff. And I don't know if they do that today or not. I haven't seen that yet um, because I've not been at the high school level to see anything of what they're doing in geometry. But I do know those theorems need to come back because they need to understand why this is
Mm-hmm.
parallel to that, or why this is congruent, or what does congruent even mean. They need to know those pieces to better understand why. So when they get into college or they go into some kind of field that involves math, they can explain why this has happened.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yes. And that's, like I said, that's that's our main drive. That's our main concern with putting this training out here today, was we didn't want people to think that we're supporting just putting a problem out there and kids copying and looking for to see if they can just make it match. That's not what we're looking. That's not what it's all about. It's about the understanding that we want to come uh, prior to giving them that representation, that abstract representation. And then it's about the understanding, as in asking those really good questions, as in why and how did you come to did they get that answer? Or why or how did they get it wrong?
Or being able to self-assess and ask themselves those questions.
Right, right. Of course, self-assess, that's big. If our kids can self-assess and they can realize that they've got something wrong and then figure out why they got it wrong, then and then self-correct it, that's where we want them to be. Then they become lifelong learners, because then they can learn, okay, I can figure out when something's not quite right. So I know that just have to keep working at it, that productive struggle we mentioned earlier, until I can figure it out and get it down pat, and then it becomes just routine for me. So that's what life's about. That's what it's been like for me. It's been lots of productive struggle.
Okay, you had an article. It's called Learning Algebra from work examples. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to think about that article that you read. It stated that most growth in students' learning was found in the classroom environment in which students considered both correct and incorrect examples. I want you to take a minute and on your structured notes page, I want you to just jot down somewhere that what your thoughts are about that and how you plan to incorporate this. And we're going to kind of share out in just a few minutes. We're going to put you in some breakout rooms for about 5 minutes, Ms. Vonda.
Yeah, I think that should be plenty of time.
Think for about 3, and then we're going to do some breakout rooms. One of the things, well, I'm going to talk about a couple of things with this worked example. One is when I think about worked examples, I think about the students' understanding that they're going to have. And the big thing that hit me in this article was one strategy to correct students' misunderstanding is combining the use of worked examples in the classroom with students' self-explanations. So making sure that that is a big part of it, making sense of that new information, the student needs to talk it through. And then the other thing was that one of the big misconceptions they had for algebra for later was the equal sign, guys, just thinking that an answer comes at the end of it. And so that seems to be a big problem all the time when we talk about algebra. I have teachers that are like, they just think that it's an answer at the end of the equal sign and it's not a balance. And so having that there. Another thing that I highlighted in this, for those of you who may not have got to read it, was that already completed problems helps direct attention to certain steps of a task, and that it focuses on questioning. So worked examples is going to focus, believe it or not, on the questioning that we're going to ask throughout. And then another thing that I really hit was it encourages students to identify the reasoning behind each step. So if we're anything that we're doing, it's the reasoning behind it. Again, that's those whys and how questions that we really, really want to focus on.
Right. And then too, I want to mention there the reasoning, when you mention reasoning, using those incorrect examples really, really fosters thinking about why. Why is that wrong? What did they do wrong? How could they have corrected that? Or how could they have done that differently to get that right? It's like we call it non-examples in our primary world, but just using those incorrect ones are very powerful. And some teachers are, in some of the research that they were doing, are afraid to show them an incorrect way to do it, thinking they'll do it that way. But if you show them it's incorrect and you tell them it's incorrect, that's when it's powerful. They have to know that it's incorrect. That way they know to look for what went wrong, why it's wrong.
And that was my next thing. Miss Wanda just jumped right on.
Sorry.
But it focuses this, if you think about incorrect ones, it focuses the students to think about the steps that have been carried out and the reasons why those actions were wrong. Why was those actions wrong? What did they do that caused that misconception? And then it confronts their own probabilities of a misconception they may have, especially when you're talking about it and you're going through it. That's the reason why also I love the parallel one, or the one that we're going to talk about later where it's partially completed. So if they're making a mistake somewhere, that partial completed will be the one that we really want to focus on maybe. So
partial completed may be better.
So, we've got some options, and that's the reason why we want to talk through all these different ones.
Because our kids are all different, right?
Oh, yeah.
And what works for one doesn't always work for all, or what works for all doesn't always work for that one.
And something else that you brought to mind, brought to my attention, talking about concrete and abstract. Years ago, I became familiar with hands-on equations, and I think it works great. And I use it a little bit. We didn't have the program, but I had some family members in another district that had it, and I used it, and it worked really well because it became that abstract became concrete.
Mm-hmm.
So I get what you're saying with all that. That works.
Yeah, it's really true. I'm not just telling a story. Yeah. It was a major aha moment for me. It really was with the algebra tiles.
Yeah.
And I came in already using the algebra tiles at my school because we were blessed enough to gear up and bought those for each one of our kids, and we had class set. And so I had used those, and I seen what my kids could do using those. So it was like, oh, these are so wonderful. We use them. We saw a big difference in our kids, and especially my kids, because then it wasn't, I guess it wasn't a stigma that they were using some kind of a tool or something, because all the kids were using them, right? So if everybody has the opportunity to use them, you can use them at any point. And we would walk around the room, and me and my co-teacher would be like, a student was struggling, go grab the algebra tiles. Didn't matter who it was. You know, if they were struggling a little bit, go grab the algebra tiles, show me how to do this.
That's a good point, Stephanie, you made that I forgot to make earlier, was that we use these tools with all students because our special ed students are gen ed students first. All students benefit from using that CSA model. And first of all, mainly because it helps everyone learn and understand. And then the bonus is that it removes that stigma about using tools. Just because you use a tool doesn't mean you don't understand it. We're all using the tools.
And I was so blessed to have a co-teacher who was like, this is our room. And we both kind of taught at, you know, at different times. And so if I was better at something or he was better at something, then we both were, you know, would teach, you know, different areas. But another thing was, he was like, carpenters have tools. He's like, doctors have tools. We all at some point use tools. And that was his big thing. These are just tools that we're using. And so that really helped for our kids to see it's okay for me to go grab a number line, or it's okay for me to go grab my algebra tiles if I need them. That was a big aha moment for us, seeing the kids just really want to get into that. So another thing that really hit me was, there's a part in this article that it talks about students that struggle, and this helps them when they're analyzing, and they're more gainful in their understanding. So keep that in mind with this too. And then there's a part, I'm going to hit it real quick. It talks about incorporating worked examples into the classroom offers a way for students to confront their own misconceptions and then to replace them with a better, deeper conceptual understanding. So keep that in mind too. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do this. Training was for you guys to get that, you know, it is all about, again, going back to that conceptual understanding and tying it in. I'm going to go ahead and talk about that What Works Clearinghouse that we had talked about before. There were recommendations for that one, and it was using solved problems to engage students, and analyzing algebraic reasoning and strategies was a big part of that. And it was to teach students to utilize structure, especially with representations. And then the other thing that article had in it was to teach students to initially choose from alternative strategies when solving problems. So those were some big ones for that article too, because I don't think that we actually go and hit on that one a whole lot. But it is a great article for you to look at. So make sure you go back to that one.
Yeah, and the important thing about that, and the reason I mentioned this, is just that it is research based. This is a strategy that's research based, and that's important, especially when we're working with our kids and we're thinking about the SDI that we're going to offer to them, that it be something that's research based.
Types of worked examples. Now, we've already talked about several of these. We've talked about correct examples and incorrect, and we also talked about just a few minutes ago about partially completed examples. But there's another one that's in there, and that's parallel examples. So I'm just going to talk real quick about the fact that if we're working with correct examples, that's it. They need to be correct. You may scaffold those correct examples in many different ways. Like I said before, color coding, highlighting, arrows, those kind of things. Those are all in there. And we're going to show a couple of those today. Now, incorrect examples, with those, make sure, it doesn't matter what kind of example it is, make sure it's marked correct or incorrect, and the students know ahead of time. That's going to be the biggest thing that you need to remember, besides the fact that they need to be arranged a certain way. So making sure that you can do that. But correct examples need to be labeled as correct.
Yep.
Incorrect needs to be labeled as incorrect, needs to be somewhere on there kind of big and bold.
Yeah, that is not the task. It's for the kids to determine whether it's correct or incorrect. Do not give them that task. That is not the purpose of this.
They won't know the difference.
That's right. Exactly. Exactly. So that is not the intent of this. You make sure that they're labeled big and bold, correct or incorrect.
And keep in mind, this is part of your design of your instruction too. So back to that HLP 12, the design of the instruction. When we're going through that, you're going to design your instruction, and I would always start with a correct example. Just because of the fact you can choose whether that correct example is going to be very complex or if it's going to be very simple, and you're going to look at one specific area that you know that's going to be a misconception, but making sure that it is a correct example that you start with so that they know what steps are there, what procedures that they may need, that they've tied it back into whatever they've been working with concretely.
Yeah, and it needs to be something that's simple anyway, because you're going to, the first time you give them one of these, you're going to teach them, it's going to be about the process.
Mhm.
How do I engage with this? Correct examples. What are these? You know, how do I answer these questions? That type of thing, because it's going to be different for them if they've never been exposed to them. It's going to ask them, because always before we've been asking for the answer. Now
Mhm.
we're not asking them for the answer. We're asking them how they got to the answer. So that's going to, so like Stephanie said, I'd use something really simple to start out with the kids, just to introduce them to the concept. So, you know, it's like playing a game. You play a game 2 or 3 times with kids just for them to understand all the rules and how to do it before you expect them to learn anything from it.
And this can be part of your learning goal, is walking through those and answering those questions. It can, and you're going to teach toward this, yes, them getting correct answer, but understanding why that answer is what it is. So problems need to be geared, like I said, toward a specific learning goal. You're going to make sure it fits whatever that example needs to fit whatever your learning goal is. And then making sure that, again, it's identified correct or incorrect. And your prompts need to be that you're going to have, you can call them prompts, you can call them questions, but those have to be a guide for you and a guide for the student to look, places to look at. You know, it may be in line 2, why did this happen? In line 3, how do you know that when I add these 2 numbers that this is what I get? So those kind of things. So making sure also that the students are going to have to talk themselves through it. Ms. Vonda, do you want to talk about parallel and partial?
Are we not going to go through the slides?
We can.
Let's just do it as we go through the slides.
Okay. So in this one, research suggests that when mathematics is limited to a set of examples to be completed, this is part of your structured notes too. Instead of a set of examples for the students to understand, students may be more focused on completing the problem than making sense of the set of examples. Basically, what it's saying is if I'm working toward an answer, I'm not always understanding why or how I'm getting to that answer.
Yeah, they're focusing on the what again. They're focusing on what the answer is, getting to the answer, instead of focusing on why that works or how does that work. Again, that's just procedure.
Step 2, why could I not just skip that part?
Mm-hmm.
For many kids, it's like, why did I have to do that step? Or sometimes they don't know what's missing in their problem. And this helps them to understand that. All right, correct examples. This is a good example of a correct example. It says Kim solved the problem correctly. Again, it says it's a correct example. It says she solved it correctly. So we know that she did this. One of the things that I left out of here when I was doing these, and I thought, wow, I should have put that in there, was the fact that there probably should have been 1/2 and 12/1. So the students understand that 12 is truly 12 parts. You know, it's truly 12
Yeah.
over 1. But in this case, I'm working on through it. I do this and I go down here and I am, if we were doing this with our manipulatives, they would see how this works out and how that 2 is 2 out of the 12 and how that breaks on down into 6. But, we've done this several times with some manipulatives. What half times 12? What's half of 12? And they would break them apart, half of 12, move them up, and they would get 6. Now, in step 3, why do you think she changed the 12 to a 6 and the 2 to a 1? And so you can talk about that. And you would walk the students through that. And then you would give them a problem again that looks exactly the same. So your turn for the students, as you can see, we've completed the first part of it, which is just basically rewriting the problem. Now, what are we going to do next? And the student can go through, rewrite the problem, work it out, and come to the correct answer. And they have the same right side of them.
Now, notice the important piece of this, though, is that question at the bottom where you ask why. Why do you think she changed the 12 to 6 and the 2 to 1? That's the important part of worked examples, are the questions that demand that the kids think about how and why.
And what's that process that they're having. So that's the part where we're going to get into of what kind of questions can I ask? What do I need to? And again, it's going to be a lot of why or how, those kind of questions. Incorrect. Again, it's marked incorrect. If you notice, I've got 1, 2, and 3. These are the steps basically that they're taking. You want to make sure they're laid out that way for them. And you want to make sure that they have the opportunity to see each step in its entirety. So in this case, we've got 46 milliliters plus 25 milliliters. And we broke this down into 40 and 6. So, and 20 and 5, because maybe that's the way that they need to do this. This is incorrect. What happened here that's incorrect? Now, this could be a kid who doesn't count up correctly, has some issues with counting up, those kind of things. Well, of course, 6 plus 5 is not correct. And then they would talk about that. Where do you see the mistake and how did it change the answer? That's the question down here. Where do you see the mistake? How does it change the answer? And so we would talk about at this point, this should have been an 11. If I go down here and I correct it at the bottom, and that becomes 60 plus 11, and then I have 71, they can talk about that. And then again, they're going to do their turn over here with the same exact type of problem, making sure that they put the milliliters at the end. We would talk about that.
And of course, they're numbered. And the reason they're numbered so that you can refer to those lines. Like you may ask the question, in line 2, what mistake was made? And then, of course, the kids back in their answer, they could say, if you left it like this, where did you see the mistake? Then the child could reply in line 2. They could identify where the mistake is at. So that's the purpose in numbering those as well.
Okay, so parallel.
All right, parallel examples. Just move on to that next slide and I'll talk about it. Says we use parallel tasks to differentiate instruction. So why not use parallel examples? So think about that. We use parallel tasks. So why not use those parallel examples when we're teaching the kids math? So you actually have a little notebook down there. So that is something on your structured notes. I try to remember to point that out because I forget myself. I think it's just a little fill in the blank. So Steph, you can move on. All right, let's look at this parallel. Notice that they're both labeled correct. And it's bold and it's in red and there's no mistake. They don't have to think about, well, is there a mistake here or not? And in this case with the parallel, the problems are exactly the same as in, how it's written out, but the approaches are different. The approach they took is different as into how that they solve the problem. So that's the approach with this parallel one. With another parallel, another way you could do a parallel is you could do a correct and then an incorrect, if you wanted to. You also could do a correct, and then you could do another same type of problem as a correct. And they could look at two different ways, two different types of problems, but they're both going to be correct. So there's different ways you could set up a parallel examples. As you can see here that they've just done the multiplication is different. What they decide, their first step is different, is what they've done, is what's different on this one. And of course, you'd ask those kinds of you'd ask that kind of question. You could ask, for example, why did Mike choose to multiply 4 times x and 4 times a -2 in line 1? So you could be very specific about where you want the kids to look at. Where do you want them to look? And that's another good strategy also for, which especially when you get into the parallels and the partially completes, you want to put a fictitious name to it. You want to put, come up with some kids' names, or use your own name if you want in those places.
Big thing with that, one also with this one that my kids would probably have trouble with. And I would say in Mike's, in line 3, how did he get -6?
And so that could be a question, like Stephanie just said. How did Mike get -6? And think about, you had to think about it. You had to really look and think, okay, what did he do to get to that? And you don't have to think about whether it was right or wrong either, because you know it's correct, because we told them it was correct. That's the good thing about making sure they know that they're correct or incorrect. So we talk about all the time how there's more than one way to get to an answer.
Mhm.
So this is an excellent way to show the kids how to do that there's more than one way to get to that final answer down there. There's there's more than one way for me to get to hazard. I'd come down 15, or I'll go around and I'll come up 80. There's more than one way for me to get to this office. So there's more than one way to solve a problem. And so if that's your goal is for the kids to understand that, then this is what you would use, this type of example.
And for some kids, it may be easier to do Mike's way, but in other kids, it may be easier to do Lisa's way.
Mm-hmm.
So you
Yeah.
need to think about that, because not all kids think the same way. So
Right.
providing multiple ways to do some things, sometimes things click for them. Well, that's a new way, or that's easier for me to see, and so they can do that.
Right. Well, I spent 30 some years in primary, and I spent the beginning of my years with doing a lot of procedure, because that's all I knew to do. That's what I was taught, and that's what we told to do. But when I started working with math intervention, I felt the same way too. I thought, oh my gosh, how in the world would I get these kids to understand this whenever I start trying to make them look at it with place values, what we're actually having them to do when we do that. But after doing it, because I had to do it and seeing it, and I worked with intervention kids, it does work, because what it does is it forces them to think about the meaning behind it. It really works on their being able to do mental math, because we want them to be able to do 42 plus 12 mentally.
Oh yeah.
That's our goal. So that's why we make them break it apart and look at the place value pieces of it. That's the reason behind it. It's not that we want to make them have to do tons of steps. We want to move away from the steps as soon as possible to where we do it mentally. Those types of problems.
Yeah, and I love it because I think mentally, and this is an activity that Vonda and I actually did with some parents, and you take just money and you give them like different things of money, and then you say, okay, now sort it and then count it. And where do you start? Well, you start with the bigger numbers. Well, in this case, why are we teaching our kids to start in the ones place? Because they don't have to. So going back to that and thinking mentally, if I'm adding something up, where do I usually start? And I start with whatever the biggest number is in that case. And if it's 600, then I'm going to start with the 6, and I go that way. But that's mentally how I do it. But also, I have an understanding of place value. So you got to keep that in mind too.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So if you think about it, like Stephanie said, if you had some cash, you're fortunate enough to have a handful of cash. Nowadays, people don't have a lot of cash, but if you had some cash you needed to count, and then you start with those greater bills first. That's where you start, and you work your way. And when we teach that traditional algorithm, that's not the way we start. We start in one's place, and we regroup, and the kids really don't think that, they don't understand that that's a 10. They think that's just a 1 they're sticking up there with those other numbers and that kind of thing. So that's why we really want them to see the place value piece in it.
And it's really hard for us when we start doing this because of the fact that we were taught a procedure. You got to think of it that way. Okay, Miss Wanda, your next one is partially complete examples.
Dana Johnson left a message in the chat, and she was talking about what Brandon was talking about earlier about learning all these new ways, you know, and then trying to build on multiple approaches. So she left a message in the chat, and of course, Brandon, you responded back to her.
Right, and of course you're right. Those basics, those fluency, fluent to 5 in our kindergarten, fluent to 10 in first grade, fluent to 20 in second grade, and by fluent I mean fluent.
Right.
To where you're not having to use your fingers, you're not having to use a lot of time, you're being flexible. When you're fluent, that's when you can do the next step.
Yes.
You're right.
That's where we're missing them right there.
Absolutely.
Right.
We have to make sure they're fluent. Absolutely. Absolutely. I did not intend to insinuate that at all.
Oh, no, I didn't think
that's when my kids that's when they would take off. When we were fluent, especially when we're fluent to 10. Wow, can you do a lot whenever you're fluent to 10? You have a huge understanding then. And then whenever you're fluent to 20, you're ready to go. Because it relieves all that, you know, that working memory that Stephanie was talking about earlier. You don't have to worry about that because it's there. But you're right, absolutely. You've got to make sure they're fluent. And I have tons of activities with that. And I've got a lot on our website that you guys can visit if you want to look at some things, some activities that will strengthen that fluency. And I don't care a bit to meet with someone. If you want to email me, and we'll set up a Zoom and I'll share with you.
Again, Wanda, when we talk about that fluency, though, what have we done so much to get to that fluency is nothing but conceptual. They've played with blocks, they played with counters, they've done so much, and they've talked it through. So they have to do those things. They have to have those in their hand. They have to have all kinds of different stuff that they've done several times, talked it through, drawn it out. They have to do that.
Yes, all of my activities are not worksheets. You won't find a worksheet with anything I do with anybody, ever. It's not. You might find a recording sheet, but there's always tools that have gone along with it. That's how I teach. That's what I believe, and I'll go to my grave believing that we have to do that. We have to get the tools in the kids' hands. And then it comes just like that. Enough tries, and they can do it. All right, I'm off my soapbox.
Well, you can partially your soapbox with partially worked examples.
All right, partially worked examples now. Notice again, they're labeled correct, both of them. And Stephanie put together this slide for us, and she did a good job color coding for us. So you can refer to all your questions can be asked as far as referring to what's in red or what's in blue. Jessie, what did Jessie do in step 2 in the red? Those types of questions. But you can see that with Jessie's work, there's part of it's been left out. The blue, step 3, is incomplete. That's what we mean by partially worked. Just steps have been left out. So you've got to look at what comes before, look at what comes after, and then plug in what's missing. They're puzzles.
Where did you got the 70 from?
From the 30 and the 40. See, again, again, we think place value. You got to think, okay, that's 38 books and 49 books that I've got in my pocket. So if I want to count all that out, I'm going to count out the 10s, or, you know, I may have 20s in there, but I'm going to put my 10s together first. Then I'm going to worry about those single bills.
And if you notice, we color coded the red circle with the number 2.
Mm-hmm. So you think about, okay, that 70 came from that 3 and that 4, which is 30. Actually, not 3, but it's 3 10s and 4 10s, which gave me 7 10s, which is 70. So now I've got to think about my 1s. I've got 8 1s and 9 1s, which gives me 17 1s. So they would think about what's missing there. And of course, in Mike's, in Mike's, the 10s are what's missing. The 40 and the 30 are what's missing there. So the partially worked examples are a really good way. I would think that I would want to use those after I've tried the others. I would want to work with my correct and my incorrect, and I'd want to look at my parallels, because partially worked, they're like puzzles. You're looking for missing pieces. So to me, that would be the one that would require a little more understanding in order to tackle those.
This would be a really good one if you're working in middle school and you're doing the order of operations. I like that for that. Of course, with that, you have to keep in mind that students may not always follow through, and there's different ones. So there's different ways. And then of course there's my way that I do with the river. And so there's multiple ways that you can do those if you're working through them. But the big thing is, like Vonda said, this is helpful to see the missing step, what would happen next. And then of course, how do you know? That's a good question. How do you know that's the step that's missing for our kids? And what helped you to determine what needed to go on line 2 or line 3? So that way you're getting that self-explanation in there. All right. So you have this little funny Stephanie's thrown in here. Says, what do you expect? My edition of the math book doesn't have answers in it like yours does. So that's what the kids think. That's why the teachers know everything they know, is because they've got all the answers in the book. But, you know, I thought about this and I thought, you know, that's might be part of what the problem is. They need some answers. They need some worked examples in these books. They need to rewrite these textbooks, if you're lucky enough to have a textbook, and put those examples in there. But it says a picture example always reinforces a concept. And that's the main goal we want you to come away with today, is the value of these worked examples. And yes, there are different types, and it depends on, like anything else, it depends on the child and their ability and what their misconception is, which type you would want to use with them. So that comes back to you just knowing your children and knowing what they need. So as Ms. Vonda has talked about, a picture or an example is always reinforcing the concept. So why do we not use full examples for us to use for our students? And that's what we're going to talk about more today. Now, points to consider when we're teaching with worked examples. First, you need to name that strategy. Make sure that you give it a name, whether it's worked examples or it's solve problems. But then the next thing is we have to explicitly teach it. Now, that's part of that SDI.
I want to stop right here, Stephanie, on that, and make sure that we reiterate that we have to explicitly teach what we're giving these examples of. This is not in place of explicitly teaching it. We have to make sure that we've taught it. This is a way for us to monitor it and see if they're getting it, if they're understanding. It's not a way to teach.
Exactly. But we have to explicitly teach this. So as SDI, it is specially designed instruction. So it's instruction on how to work through or to work with a worked example. So if I've got a worked example there, we need to make sure that we are explicitly teaching how to use that worked example in everyday activities that they're doing. Now, the other thing is to model using a previously taught content. This is a good reteaching moment. So keep that in mind. It can be used to bring in new content, but it's really, really, really important to think of it as a model for previously taught content. So this is a good time right before we give a formative assessment to bring these examples out and walk through them. Third thing is use think alouds. Identify the how and the why. Again, the how and the why is what we're going to do most of our questions with. It's not going to be the what. We're not looking for an answer. The answer's already there. We want to know how, or why they did the next step. And so you're going to be looking at those steps and strategies inside that problem. And then, of course, incorporate this into your instruction. This can be a bell ringer. This can be station teaching. This can be done as a whole group. It can be done small group. And so keep that in mind. These can be incorporated throughout your instruction. They're not, oh, we're just going to do this today.
Yeah, it's not a worked example day. It should flow beautifully. It should not be something you stop and throw in one here and there about this and that. It should work to enhance your lesson.
Exactly. And also embed this in independent practice. So another thing is, I was incorporating into instruction. If you've got a student who is really mastering that concept, let them be a teacher in it too. So that's another thing to consider. All right, steps in creating worked examples. Ms. Wanda, you want to go over this one?
Sure. Like I'd asked you before in day one, I asked you to determine a standard that you wanted to work with. That's selecting that goal. That's what that's referring to. And you're going to gear that problem toward a learning goal with common student errors in mind. When you choose that standard, I want you to think about the errors that you know that your kids are probably going to make. It's things that you just, you anticipate, so you pre-correct it. If you expect it, you pre-correct it. That's from coming from Anita Archer there. Then you select a type. Determine, it depends on what your standard is, what you're trying to get across to the kids, what type of work example you're going to use. You're going to either use that correct one, or you may use a parallel or a partially complete. And we feel that those incorrect ones need to be hold off on those until you feel the kids are getting it and understanding it. And it's a good way of checking them for their understanding, especially when you're doing a review, to make sure that they still understand what you're trying to get across. So those incorrect ones we don't want to use too early on in our lessons. And then of course you select your prompts and make sure that they're numbered and labeled clearly. Make sure they're labeled correct or incorrect, and make sure that the questions you ask are intentional, that they're going to guide the student's thinking from step to step. And of course, you can think about how you might need to scaffold this. You may need to use color coding or underlining or arrows or highlighting, and depending on what the kids need. And of course, those are the types of things that you can remove once you feel like the kids are comfortable with working those types of problems.
Exactly. And just remember that scaffolding, when you're taking that away, take away one step at a time. Don't try to take all of it away, because that may be a problem.
Now, it's truly what a scaffold is. You don't remove it all at once. You remove it a layer at a time. And of course, the highlights of what we've talked about here. We've talked about the research. You've read some of the research that we have found, and it all supports that worked examples enhances that student learning. And it is an effective approach for real world, for classrooms. The examples that we give, the scenarios we give, they need to be something that the students can relate to. Anytime we can relate something to the real world, the kids are more interested in it, especially if it can be something that's current going on in the news, or something that's current for or appropriate for their age or grade level or whatever their interest is. That's what we need to try to do with our problems. And of course, having students explain incorrect examples helps to improve conceptual understanding. If you have a child that can explain why something's incorrect, then that child will be able to explain that to another student. So that's a child that you could pair up and use a little peer tutoring with. And there's nothing wrong with peer tutoring. Peer tutoring just solidifies and it enhances the learning and the understanding of the one who is doing the tutoring and the one that the child is working with. Because lots of times those children may be able to relate to a peer when they can't relate to an adult that's in the room.
Okay, and now it's time for you guys to actually work on your problems. So what we're going to do is we're going to break up into different groups, and we're going to work on, if you're K5, you'll go with Miss Wanda, and if you are middle school or high school, you'll stay with me. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to give you some examples of some worked examples. And then remember, when I talk about worked examples, that means the entire example is worked out. They have an answer. They know the answer is there. One of the things I want to go through and look at these worked examples with you is to make sure you're hitting all of the high points that you need to do. So a good example is it's titled, and that would be maybe the title you would choose, or you could choose using worked examples. So in this case, we're using the strategy today of using solved problems, or like I said, I would title it, we're using worked examples today, and this is what we're going to be doing. So the first one says the example is to solve by completing the square. And so it's x squared plus 12 squared plus 32 is equal to 0. The big thing that we have talked about is that you have to have the matched problem. And in this case, your matched problem is very similar. If you look, it's x squared plus 14x, very similar to the 12x, plus 32 equals 0. Same. Like I said, extremely similar. And like we talked about before, this has to be extremely similar. This is marked correct, very bold, and that makes it very important. Again, the student needs to know this is a correct example or is an incorrect example. The format here is very important too. If you notice, each line is labeled as, or it's actually marked as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the reason being is I can go back to line 1. In line 1, why did they choose to subtract 32 from the sides, both sides in line 1? So why did they choose to do that? Again, in line 3, the student divided 12 by 2. And in this case, 12 by 2. Why was that? What happened to cause that? Those kind of things, you're asking those questions. Again, those why questions are extremely important. So keep that in mind. We're asking a lot of whys or a lot of how questions sometimes. So again, matching the problems, making sure it's marked correct, making sure these are aligned to where they're spaced out also to where the student can differentiate between them. And these questions are extremely important. This is our guide here. Remember, this is a part of our guide, and we're looking for a misconception that may be very important for our students. So a misconception they're doing is what we're looking for with those questions. Now, again, and I want to thank Mark at CKEC for these examples because I got them from him. Again, here's 40, a good example because we've got correct as marked. We have example, the match problem. They're very, very similar. This is using the area model. So they broke down 42 into 40 and 2. You can see that they broke down 12 into 10 and 2. And then they completed the problem by 10 times 40 gives me 400. 10 times 2 gives me 20. 2 times 2 gives me 4. 2 times 40 gives me 80. And then here, of course, 400 plus 80 gives me 480. 20 plus 4 gives me 24. Again, I took these two and I added them together and I got 504. Now, 504. And the questions down here lead right back to that. How did Sadie know she could split the sides of both rectangles into 40 and 2 and the top into 10 and 20 on the sides? Now, that's a good question. How did she know that? Well, she had no place value. 400, I'm sorry, where did 400 come from in the larger rectangle? So now if you got this one, what are we doing here? So she looked here, well, she had to multiply, and that's where I got the 400. Then how did Sadie get 480 and 24? So 480 and 24 was when she added the insides up. How did she get 480 plus 24? Here, this part here. Why did she do that? Well, technically we're going to add the entire inside up to get the answer. So therefore, it's kind of like the area model. So here we are. And then, of course, they're going to complete their own problem. Again, marked correct. One of the things I pointed out on here, again, problems to solve are very similar. It's clearly marked correct. Each line is marked, and you can see good distinguishing between the lines. And then, of course, down here, I can go back to line 1. I can look at line 2, line 5. And those questions, again, are hows and whys. A lot of why questions here. And you may have a what at some point, but what's usually an answer question. And we don't usually typically use what questions with worked examples. So again, those kind of questions. So that's another correct. Let's look at an incorrect now. An incorrect is here. And we talked through this one. How did he do it incorrect? Again, these questions are written specifically for a common error. So what numbers did Dalton incorrectly combine to get -2? So this student is having trouble with combining these numbers. And so that's important to know. I'm -6 in debt, and I go another -4, where am I at? It should have been -10. So what are they doing wrong? And talking through those and what should he have gotten when he combined the two terms. So again, if I'm focusing on the fact that this student has trouble with integers, then I'm going to use this again. The next one, again, clearly marked incorrect. I'm going to go back to this one. If you notice, these are extremely similar, and I love the fact that these are both negatives. So if they're having a trouble with integers, you want to make sure these match problems are extremely similar. This part is exactly the same, and the only thing changes is between the -6 and the -8. Love that. Now, the next one here, incorrect. There's a problem, and we know what terms did Maria multiply to get -12 times 18x minus 4. And what happened there, and why did she not get something different? So you want to talk about that. And so again, like I said, marked incorrect, clearly marked. Student knows this is incorrect. There's a problem in it. Where is the problem at? So those are the two big ones we talked about. Now I'm going to move on to parallel. Parallel means I've got two problems. And in this case, I have the problem here. And then, of course, here's the other problem. And then I've got Sarah's and Juan's. And so here we are looking at those. You can look at them as how did they do them differently. You could do it a correct and an incorrect if you wanted to, but I would make sure I marked that so-and-so's was incorrect. In this case, we know they are both correctly solved. And so both solved correctly, very well marked that this is a correct. So, and then you're going to compare and contrast the two methods and which one would you prefer and why? And that's all that you're doing with this one. And so the questions are up here, but I really like that you're comparing and contrasting two methods. That's the reason why we have a parallel. So if you choose to do a parallel, they're doing the same problem. So keep that in mind. Just maybe doing it differently. So this is one way you could set up a parallel if you wanted to. Now, this is a partially completed worked example. Now, I like this one because if a student's need to work on a certain area or they need steps to get to it. Now, in this case, the problems are again extremely similar. If you look, 7x, 2x, in this case, they're going to distribute through here. But again, you've got -6x over here. Plus 6 plus 3 equals, in this case, I've got a -2x, but I've got 12 minus 7x where they have to distribute. The difference is that the whole number here is at the beginning and here it's at the end. And then you've got +1 minus 4. So very similar problems. This one, they've just flipped them. So like I said, very similar problems. They're going to go through. I like that down here is the place, line 5 is where I'm having to fill out. If you notice, all of them have the answers. All of them have the answers. But down here's where I need to fill out. Up here, it's a little closer, and then of course it's line 2. What do I need to do there? So that's a partially completed problem. Partially complete, I like these. And again, these are all the steps that they've worked on here is worked correctly. It's you determining what the steps is for each one that comes next. So how do you know what to write on line 5? And in this case, what are they going to be doing? They're going to be getting rid of the 6. So they're going to be moving the 6, right? And so they can do that. In this one, what did you need to write here? They're going to distribute the 2 out. So go look at that. And even get rid of the 2. All right. So, and then over here, what do they need to do? So, like I said, and then I like how this one was written. I like how this one was written. How did clues from other lines help you determine what should go on line 2? Love that. Now, earlier, Vonda and I talked about using this and also using our CSA mat. So I'm going to show you how you can do this coinciding with this. Now, here is a problem. This one is marked correct. Put a couple of questions down here. But if I was doing this, I would also have this map, and I want to put this for right now here. I want to show you how we can do this and make sure that we've got everything going at the same time. So if I have this problem, I'm going to say, hey, let's kind of work through this and look at this. So if you've used algebra tiles before in the past, you know this is x squared, and all the reds are negatives, and this is x, and of course we have the ones units. So in this case, we've got 2x plus 4 and I'm going to my marker here, my pencil, real quick to draw a line, because that's my 2x plus 4 is equal to 12. So I'm coming over here and putting 12. As you can see, putting my 12 on here, and we can see that. So there's my 12. Now, in this case, I need to get rid of these 4. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a negative 4. This would be this one right here, actually. If we look at it right now, this would be where this is coming in. So I'm creating what we call 0 pairs. So these would 0 out. And if I create a 0 pair on this side and get rid of it, then I want to create that same 0 pair on this side. And I'm going to get rid of this. So now I'm left with 2x is equal to 8. At this point, I have to separate up my 2x's because I just want them to be 1. I'm going to fair share. So if I fair share, this x is equal to 4, and this x is equal to 4. So 1x is equal to 4. See how they can see that? Now, the semi-concrete means I just draw this out. Do the same thing. And they can see this again. And I'm just going to draw it out. I could draw this out as I was doing it. And that's typically what I would have my students do when they're familiar with these. Oops. So they're going to draw them out. And so Here we go. And then now I'm going to take away 4 because I'm going to make negatives. And so we've got 0 pairs. Sometimes my kids will do this so that way they can see the 0 pairs. I create another bunch of 0 pairs over here. Then they can mark these out. And then I can say, I'm going to turn my X's around if I wanted to. Or I could say, these all go with this one, and these go with this one. So my X is equal to 4. And so that's the way they can see that. And then they can write the problem out down here if they need to. But in this case, they've got it here. And I love the fact that on this one, again, my answers are the same, but I went from 2x plus 4 to 3x plus 4. And so the students are working with smaller numbers below 20 that they're very comfortable with. If you have any questions, just let us know.
But what I'd like for you to do is take that template, one of those, if you'd like to, or if you want to create your own, by all means, you can do that. And think about whatever standard that you are going to be working on next, or whatever one you think will benefit working or reviewing with your kids. And you're going to choose to do either worked examples, a correct one, an incorrect, partially correct, or parallel. We'd like for you to choose and do 2 of those. You don't have to do all 4, just 2 of them. And then you will email those to us. And then once we receive them, we will send you an email back. Like all of you that are with me today, right now, will send them to me. And everyone that went with Stephanie will send them to her. So I will then send you a link to do a little evaluation for us. And then it will, as soon as you submit that, it will shoot you a certificate. Okay.